Thank you very much. So this is, do I need to press anything on this? Is it working, the mic? Okay. This is my talk on improving user research practice and legal compliance. My name is Jozef Kulik, and just to provide a little bit of an intro to myself, I have a PhD focused on human-computer interaction and particularly accessibility, background in psychology, currently working at PlaytestCloud as the research and accessibility lead. I was previously at Splash Damage as their accessibility program manager, and before that, player research. I've worked with various different studios, particularly as a user researcher, but sometimes contributing to accessibility as well. Worked with many different methods, many different kind of platforms, console, PC, mobile, VR. Worked with lots of diverse audiences as well. And these are some of the games that I've worked on in the past too. This talk is going to be focused on two key areas. One, talking about accessibility legislation. We have the European Accessibility Act, which is kind of in a hot topic of conversation at the moment. So we'll be going through that, talking about the scope of that legislation, talking about the impact for games, talking about action to take, and then connecting that to user research. And then we'll also be talking about research itself. So research is this key feedback avenue for players with disabilities into the games industry. However, there are some challenges around accessibility. We're talking about what those challenges are and how they might be addressed to improve process. So in terms of the kind of current accessibility legislation, the kind of big thing on everyone's minds at the moment in the accessibility space and the game accessibility space is the European Accessibility Act. And this is a European directive aimed at harmonizing accessibility requirements across EU member nations. So this in itself is a directive and not in itself a law, but it directs how each EU member nation transposes law into their local documentation and policy making. This is wide-reaching, so it affects hardware and services. It affects things like communications, payment systems, audiovisual media, websites, applications, etc. And we'll be going through a few kind of key components of the European Accessibility Act, talking about scope, requirements, time frame, implications for games, and then also tying that with kind of how user research can help us. So in terms of scope, lots of areas within scope for the European Accessibility Act. But if we focus in on games particularly, so there are a few areas that are kind of more relevant to us than others. So I haven't highlighted computer and operating systems here because I think it's unlikely that it's going to apply to most studios. Like computer and operating systems might apply if you are kind of PlayStation, Microsoft, and you're making hardware, you're making the operating system that hardware uses. But for most studios, where it's going to be, where their games might be in scope, might be in relation to communication services and e-commerce related aspects and mobile apps. So this is kind of, if you are thinking about things like the communication features in games, so if you think about voice chat, you think about text chat, if your game has those features, then it might be in scope of the European accessibility legislation. And then if you are making a game and it has a payment option inside of it, so it has a storefront in a mobile application, maybe it's a match 3 and you're buying gems or something like that on a mobile application, then that can be considered as part of the scope for the European Accessibility Act and transposed legislation as well. In terms of the time frame and consequence, the European Accessibility Act is applicable in the EU member states from June 28, 2025, so it's effectively already taking place. And there's already some early signs that there is some legislative action being taken against organizations that are inaccessible, particularly in the non-game space at the moment. So like very high-profile retailers have been targeted by like disability groups who are rightfully complaining about the accessibility of their services and then using the Accessibility Act as a mechanism in which to do that. Public accessibility complaints can trigger legal action. Companies can be fined and sued for inaccessibility. Businesses must proactively ensure compliance. Simply waiting for a notice, it's often going to give you something around the ballpark of 3 months, would be too late, particularly on the basis of the notice is going to request things like documentation from you and evidence of user testing and things like that as part of your process. So often just waiting for the legislation would be too late to be able to prove you've tried to make it accessible. And the consequences can range from substantial fines within each EU member nation to full or partial restrictions on product distribution, which means the product could be removed from sale depending on how the directive is transposed. So in terms of the kind of scope of application in a little bit more detail, so talking about kind of communication service, what might they look like in a game? So this is, as I mentioned before, talking about things like voice chat and talking about things like text chat. If you have a mechanism in your game that could be considered a way that people are socializing, a way that people are communicating with their friends or other people online, then that would be in scope of what's considered a communication service. And this is an example of a game like Call of Duty where you might have people chatting. And one of the kind of ways that you see this made more accessible is kind of through things like text-to-speech and speech-to-text, and providing other channels of communication in those platforms as well. But then you also have the e-commerce side too, which is, again, things like the in-game monetization, in-game storefronts. The key thing, though, also in both these instances, is that to make these components accessible, it must not just be the individual area, so it can't just be the communication service, but the pathway to it as well. So as you can imagine, if you are, say, someone who is wanting to engage with the game that maybe has low vision or something like that, and the communication service needs to be accessible, then they must also be able to kind of go through the boot flow of the game. They must be able to navigate the interface. They must be able to start the game and get to that position where they're kind of communicating with other players. So it has further-reaching consequences than just these communication and e-commerce aspects. But what does accessible mean exactly? So it's easy to say, well, these things should be accessible, but what does accessibility really mean? So the European Accessibility Act specifies that products need to be made accessible as per the EN 30549 documentation. This doesn't really provide us that much more clarity. I'm not familiar with that in and of itself. But foundational to this is WCAG 2.1 and fundamentally POUR, which is known as kind of perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So that means that the interface and such must be perceivable to people of different disability categories. They need to be operable by people with different abilities. So that might be someone, say, with a motor disability or playing without being able to interface with the game in the same way as other players. They must be understandable for, say, people with different kind of abilities or people who are neurodiverse and those kind of aspects as well. And they must be robust, which means they need to be kind of flexible and used by different people in different contexts and that side of things in terms of accessibility. More directly, though, the implications for games mean things like providing screen reader support and menu narration, providing text-to-speech and speech-to-text, providing things like control remapping, providing minimum font sizes, support for text scaling, ensuring that moving content can be paused so people aren't rushed to read something, and ensuring that there's no flashing content that might trigger any issues with photosensitivity. There are lots of other kind of recommendations that I could make, but these are the kind of core examples of the type of means in which this might manifest in your game. In terms of what to do, so it's a matter of, so that's the kind of overview of the European Accessibility Act, but from there, we're talking about kind of design and implementation, looking at how the Act maps down to kind of common accessibility guidelines, and then prioritizing for your game which areas should be kind of key considerations for accessibility. So this would be things like, if you look at the game accessibility guidelines, okay, which ones of these do overlap with legislation as well? And you can use this also as part of like the way you prioritize. Like, well, yes, these ones are high impact for groups of people with disabilities, and then on top of that, these ones are in line with legislation that kind of makes it more important for that we kind of fulfill these as well. The design and implementation feeds into documentation, so you're implementing kind of the ways in which these features are being made accessible. You're kind of documenting how you're prioritizing and defining things that should be made accessible. And then that also ties up with feedback and testing as well. So things like accessibility auditing or accessibility playtesting, they, one, enable you to kind of test your design and implementation, enable you to verify that it isn't just speculative, that you've made the game accessible. You can see that experience with real players. But on top of that, also, it provides that documentation. It kind of provides a paper trail for how you're designing the game to kind of fulfill these requirements as per the European Accessibility Act, but also then proving them out and kind of evidencing that as part of the process. So if you had a complaint filed against the game or the service you're running in the future, you can say, well, this is how we kind of prioritize the design and the features. This is how it's been made accessible. You can put an accessibility statement, which is also a requirement of the Act. And then you can also demonstrate, well, also we tested this with real players, so we had made like a real concerted effort to make this product accessible. So we're going to tie this in with user research as well, because one component of that that model of how to kind of engage with this process was feedback and testing as well. And user research can be seen as one of the key avenues in which the voice of the player is already expressed in games. So we already have feedback loops built into the game development process. We already have means in which we can listen to players and address their feedback towards improving the experience. However, without consideration, these feedback loops exclude players with disabilities. And there is scope for inclusive research to benefit compliance and beyond, which means, yes, we can help with kind of letting you hit those targets as defined by the European Accessibility Act or the CVAA in the US or anything like that, but then also it can be about more broadly improving the player experience and helping the game reach more players through accessibility. So I think it's worth kind of giving some consideration to kind of earlier stages in user research. So this is a screenshot from, in game theory research, this is a screenshot from, not a screenshot, a photograph of Carol Cantor in the 1970s, who was like an early market researcher in games. I think the first person who was really observing people play games as part of the process in which they were being made, and getting insight from that experience to kind of inform the way games were being made and improved over time. But one thing that we can also kind of infer here is that process in itself probably wasn't that accessible. Like in this photograph here, there is a, that you were playing at an arcade unit of some description, you were playing standing. It probably was difficult to get to that space. It probably inherently excluded some types of people with certain types of disabilities. Over time, obviously, we've scaled that process up, so we have physical user research labs, and we have lab space and things like that, and there have been considerations made to make those accessible, but I wouldn't say accessibility has ever been the kind of primary concern or one of the kind of key concerns of the construction of those spaces, and the physicality of them in itself sometimes can make them inaccessible. Some of the concerns that people might have when going in to test for a user research study might be, do they have the equipment I use at home? Will my wheelchair fit into the desk? Will my wheelchair fit into the elevator? Will it fit into the doorway of the lab? Anything like that. Can I play in the position that I usually do? Like, for instance, in some of the studies that I ran before, I had people playing in bed who were kind of set up to play their games by their carer or support worker or family member, etc. They might not be able to be accommodated in a lab environment or might be very anxious about whether they would be. Other people might be experiencing something like social anxiety and something more on the kind of like mental health or cognitive side that makes it a barrier for them to taking part in these in-person tests. There are a lot of comorbidity with things like immunocompromised people who might have other disabilities as well, and therefore might be worried about going in person to a test on that basis. They might be worried about how they communicate. Maybe they need BSL, ASL, and things like that, and is your lab equipped to do that? Is your lab equipped to communicate with these players? Some people with photosensitivity might be worried about the kind of lighting conditions and aspects like that. And all sorts of other kind of considerations that they maybe feel comfortable with at home, but maybe will not in your lab environment. And on top of that, we also have to talk about the journey to a user research lab, which in itself has its accessibility challenges. This can be anything from inaccessible roads and pavements to needing sighted assistance for a player that's blind and needs to travel there, to kind of the transport system and whether it has step-free access. And not just the physicality of these things, but the information as well. Is the transit system like communicating in a way that is clearly easily understandable by players? Can they navigate all the kind of interface and things to get there as well? So another aspect, so that we've talked so far about kind of the inaccessibility of the lab environment and its journey, but another aspect of inaccessibility might also be the screening process. To get people to take part in your playtest, they might have to attend a process that's inaccessible, a complete and inaccessible recruitment screening form, so the kind of documentation and way you screen players in might not work for all players. But then they must have experience with a vast array of inaccessible games. Like if you imagine you're kind of testing the newest like Call of Duty or sci-fi shooter of some degree, you're going to ask them if they played Destiny, if they played previous Call of Duty games, etc. And those games are not accessible, so they are automatically likely to be disqualified from the testing process on that basis. And on top of that, they have to make a high-effort journey, which might be inaccessible itself. In addition to that, unfortunately, people with disabilities also experience like explicit and implicit discrimination. So biases in interpretation of kind of insights they give, such as blaming their disability for kind of issues that they have, rather than recognizing them as issues with the game and the environment that you've built. Dismissing findings on the basis that they're an outlier or something like that. Well, it's only this player, they have a very specific condition and we're not going to see them again or something like that. or using discriminatory or unpleasant language that makes participants distrusting as part of the process. Like if you don't match the language that they use, if you use language that is offensive, which is easy to accidentally do if you haven't worked with people with disabilities before, then it could make them less trusting of you as user researchers and less likely to be open in communicating with the issues they experience. So we've talked a lot about the kind of problems there, and now I'm going to talk about kind of how we might begin to kind of address some of those as well. So one of the things is a kind of inclusive recruitment. So we talked about the issue around getting people into the test and kind of tests inherently filtering people out. One of the ways you can get around that is by making active effort to include people with disabilities in the testing process and either run tests exclusively for accessibility testing or kind of supplement existing tests with people with disabilities. And there are charities and organizations that you can work with that have disability player panels that can help you do that, basically. And that could be either on a remote basis or an in-person basis, depending on where you're located and where those panels are located. You can also work with playtesting partners that bridge that gap. So there are the companies like PlaytestCloud that offer remote playtesting service with people with disabilities as well. So that is an option too. Or you can kind of build your own internal disability player panel yourself and kind of consider within your player base how those players might need accommodations and how you can kind of maybe prioritize those players for testing and then kind of accept there are some concessions around what games they might have been able to play and things like that because of those games being historically inaccessible. The thing I would say on that is if you're testing to improve the accessibility of a game and you're accepting that the genre itself might be inaccessible, you have to recognize that the new games must be, and they're likely to be an entry point for certain groups of players. So it's more about having an interest in playing those games and kind of feeling that they have wanted to but been left out in the past. It should be a relevant recruitment criteria rather than having 20 hours of gameplay on Call of Duty in the last week or whatever it is that you require. Equitable pay. So this is the other factor. We talked about how much additional effort it takes to go into the lab and everything around that. Participation in user research studies often has a higher cost for people with disabilities. So that includes time and effort, the assistive tech setup, which might take more time. It might require them to give more information. It might require them to bring things themselves. They might have to navigate barriers and difficulties to get to the venue. And all of this entails like greater emotional and mental labor as well. So one of the ways you can help compensate for that is by paying people with disabilities more to participate in your studies. Realistically, because of this additional labor, they're not as likely to be able to do as many other things on either side of this, so it literally consumes more from them to take part, and therefore the right thing to do is to compensate them fairly for that. The other thing to consider is whether your lab space is accessible. I'm not going to tell you to relocate your lab and redesign everything to make it accessible. If you've been in a building that's built the way it is for many years, then that's when you might not be able to make all the accessibility considerations. It might not be the case that you can reconstruct the building to have an elevator and things like that, but there are still kind of partners that you can work with and solutions that you can work with to kind of work around the inaccessibility of a physical space. But the things to consider are things like parking, entry, bathrooms, desks, equipment, but then also exit and emergency. And I mentioned that last one because people tend to forget about that. It's not only the case that people need to be able to get into and use all the facilities in the building, but also when there is an emergency, so there's a fire and the elevator doesn't work, they need to have a plan for those people to be able to navigate that space and exit it safely as well. In terms of improving the journey, so obviously we talked about the journey being quite difficult. There is always going to be a risk with certain aspects of the journey and inaccessibility there, but there are lots of ways and lots of things that you can do to improve that and make it less likely they encounter accessibility issues. And this can be providing clear information on how to get to the building and information about the building and its accessibility, providing a collection service so that you can kind of, if they say that, well, I can get to the train station, they make that journey regularly, but I don't really know how to navigate Bromley or Antwerp or wherever else, then maybe you meet them at the train station and maybe you collect them and take them to the lab that you're testing with and help them on that journey. Maybe you provide video guides to navigate that space so it's a little bit more visual if that's what they need and benefit from. Maybe providing transport fees or taxis, etc. Or paying for the assistant/family member's time if that's something that they need to kind of get to your space. The other aspect is in terms of especially navigating the journey, obviously that's eliminated when it comes down to kind of remote playtesting. Remote playtesting allows players to use a set that already works for them in their house. There's no journey to the lab. Avoids barriers that might have been associated with traversal and it enables you to tap into very diverse experience that are realistically sometimes not likely to be able to be recorded in the lab, even if you make it accessible. Like I mentioned before, I've had players in studies that I've ran where they are typically playing games from their bed and would be kind of set up with assistants to play games in their bed. And those players just aren't likely to be attending the in-person lab, regardless of the kind of accessibility considerations you put in place to improve that experience. And this also enables you to kind of tap into the specialized equipment they might use, which might be difficult to kind of have all of that in your lab at any one time. Another aspect to think about is also the task that you're presenting there, like our methods, like the Think Aloud protocol you've chosen to use. Is that accessible? Is it the case that all players can use that and verbalize in the same way? Or maybe our surveys easy for people to fill out as well, and kind of considering like how you can make accommodations in the process to capture feedback from people who might communicate differently. Will someone who's socially anxious be able to use Think Aloud? Will they be able to take part in a multiplayer playtest? Again, asking about accommodations that you can make in the process and kind of trying to change things, like being upfront, being transparent about the process initially, and then asking if they need any accommodations to take part is a good way to kind of identify where these accessibility issues might be for each player, and then making accommodations on the basis of that. And just thinking about kind of how the method you've chosen will affect the data that you'll be able to collect with certain groups of players with certain sets of abilities as well. And in terms of kind of ensuring that you're not kind of dismissing player feedback and kind of making sure that the feedback from players with disabilities is valued, it's important not to dismiss them as outliers or anomalies, and kind of having conversations with your team and training your team so that that's recognized. Understanding the data within the context of the social model of disabilities, which means kind of framing the issues they're experiencing within the context of being caused by the environment that you've built, being caused by the game, rather than caused by the person and their disability. And understanding also the scope of accessibility and design options that you can use to iterate is valuable as well. It's likely that your teams won't have internal expertise on all the different accessibility options that could be considered, and user researchers can be a valuable resource to kind of provide some input there and help them understand things like the game accessibility guidelines or the Xbox accessibility guidelines, or whichever you find most useful, and communicate that internally as part of the solutions as well. Because unlike some usability studies that are more traditional and non-accessibility focused, there are fairly standardized solutions for some accessibility problems at least, and it's always worth it if you don't have subtitles saying that, well, there is a standard for this, there is a good practice, a best practice for how you implement subtitles, and kind of directing your teams towards specific resources and specific information. So just to provide a summary, compliance is an important and sometimes first step towards accessibility. Sometimes it can be the kind of initial foot in the door or motivator. Accessibility compliance tied to specific features has wide-reaching implications for accessibility beyond the kind of individual features themselves. However, there are also benefits of going beyond compliance towards making accessible games and towards improving the user experience and inviting more people into play. User research is an established critical avenue for feedback that we have as part of our development process. However, it's inaccessible for players with disabilities quite often. There are a wide range of considerations that you can make to help, and including various options that you can make accommodations via, or remote testing as well, and/or remote testing. And then I'll leave you just with this slide. The U in UX doesn't stand for users without disabilities. So we kind of advocate for this idea that we are making games for our users, and our users inherently includes people with disabilities. So we should be creating processes that are considerate of that fact. As a discipline, user research has a responsibility to represent our users, and equitable user testing requires conscious engagement to improve process. Like, this isn't just going to improve on its own, and historically there's maybe some evidence that less deliberate consciousness to that process has left people with disabilities behind, and actively perhaps filtered them out of our process in which we are kind of gathering feedback, which constructs how games are being made. Thank you. That's the end of my talk, and I don't know if I have time for questions. We do? Yeah, we do. Okay. Yeah. Cool. If you're fine with it. Yeah, no.
All right. Thank you so much for this great and important talk. We have a few questions. We'll see how many we can go with. Maybe one or two, we'll see. How do we avoid generating bad feelings in dev teams on saying needing to adjusting aspects of the game due to legal obligations? What's the best way to approach it?
Yeah, I think it is a difficult one because ideally you don't necessarily want to be kind of you want to kind of use the carrot rather than the stick most of the time. So ideally you want to be working with your teams to create this mindset towards like user-centered design and an extension of that also thinking about accessibility and disability first. I would only say that compliance is something that maybe needs to be a key motivator. Well, one, when your game aren't meeting those kind of requirements for compliance, and two, I guess when the other kind of messages aren't coming through and you're kind of like finding it difficult to kind of have those conversations. It really depends on which stakeholder you're talking to. When I am speaking to legal or maybe like senior leadership, it might be the case that I would use the compliance angle. But when I'm speaking to a designer, what I usually think is they want their designs, you know, that if you're a creative person, usually you want that product or creativity to be experienced by as many people as possible. And I think very rarely it's the case that a creative wouldn't say that. So it really is like a stakeholder management challenge and kind of figuring out their persuasion points and then using the different motivations, which might be compliance or some other benefit or some wider design experiential goal there, depending on which stakeholder you're speaking to. Yeah.
How specific and tangible are the EEA in its application towards games? Are there known areas to focus on to avoid being penalized?
Yeah, so the European Accessibility Act and the 509 technical requirements documentation does provide like a very exhaustive list of specific criteria, which will include things like ensuring that ensuring that the service in the way that it's framed in the documentation would be, or the app or something like that, has second channel support, and then that has to be translated into games. So ideally, that's something you'd have to pass down into games and kind of. What I was doing internally at the studio I was working at before would be kind of looking at the game accessibility guidelines or the Xbox accessibility guidelines, looking at the legislation and then marking against those guidelines which ones were in line with legislation, so which were the kind of like the minimum standards we need to do for legal compliance, and then which ones were kind of like within reach for us, and then we might have another stretch goal which is kind of like more innovative or less in reach, but things that we want to achieve over time. So I would be kind of prioritizing based on like a 3-tiered system where it's like legal compliance, things that are feasible within the technical scope of our products, and then things that we want to do but can't do at the moment and would like to reach over time. Yeah.
This seems like an immense amount of work for small studios to be able to do. Is the advice in this case to hire an existing lab to do this research?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on what angle, so immense amount of work. So I don't know if we're talking specifically about the compliance angle here or the user research side of things. But what I would say on the user research side, like if you're already running research in some way, examine that process a little bit and consider whether people with disabilities would be inherently screened out of that process. And then when you have people with disabilities able to come through in the screeners, and that side of things, ask about accommodations, ask if there's things that they might require to participate in your research, and that can be a good step. But the other thing I would say, it's not necessarily extremely cost-intensive or work-intensive to run, say, as a starting point, one accessibility-focused playtest for your product. We previously had Oliver talk about, I think it was but essentially one round of playtesting that fed into that game, and that was a very small indie project, right? So if you're making a project that is, I don't know what development costs of that product were, but they were just like someone's time and $1,000 or something like that. So if you're making a game that it costs X million to make or anything like that, why can't you run one accessibility project there and then feed that into the process? And even if it doesn't make changes, even if it doesn't make big changes to the game, it might make some, and it might change the mindset to some of your developers around the way you're designing things and the way you're thinking about the design.
All right, thank you. We're going to cut it here. Thank you so much, Jozef, for your insights.